lot of long-range strike missiles means that you can start taking out those ammo dumps, rail lines, command and control facilities. One can also potentially go after the aircraft that launched some of the bombs that, some of the missiles that attacked on July 8th. One could potentially go after certain defense factories with longer range strike systems. So, long range strike, provided at a larger scale, could be a game changer in terms of enabling the Ukrainians to hit and focus on the vulnerable rear area facilities of the Russian military, as opposed to having to bang their heads against the entrenched and more robust Russian frontline units. Hi, I'm Marc DeVore. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of St. Andrews, where I specialize in military innovation and defense technologies. Prior to that, I've been an outside advisor to South Korea's Agency for Defense Development since 2015. I've also advised the Swiss government on defense procurement, and I've co-authored a book that was required reading by comptrollers at the Pentagon. So the NATO summit NATO has annual summits, so they were going to meet regardless as to whether there was the Ukrainian war. But obviously, Ukraine is going to be front and center in this year's summit. Now, I think that probably the most interesting decisions at the summit are going to be in the margins. Now, in the year leading up to the summit, a big question was, what would Ukraine's path to NATO membership look like? A large question also was going to be, who would the Secretary General be? Because at last year's NATO summit, there was a failure to agree on a new Secretary General between Eastern European countries who wanted a more forward-leaning Secretary General when it comes to Ukraine, and NATO's earlier members who were perhaps looking for a more low-key Secretary General. So those big decisions were essentially determined in a consensual way over the last some months. Mark Rutte is a compromise candidate in terms of the Secretary General. Ukraine is not going to be significantly advanced in terms of its pathway to membership, but the alternative has been a number of NATO states have signed bilateral security agreements. So I think that those were the big diplomatic questions that preceded the summit and that were resolved well in advance. Now, at the summit itself, a lot of personal diplomacy is going to be at play. This is going to be the first summit that the new UK government is attending, elected on the 4th of July, took power on the 5th. They're flying off to Washington on the 9th. This is going to be the first summit that Macron is attending after his own governmental coalition has significantly shifted, and where we don't really know, and where the French ministers are lame ducks. This is obviously a summit where Biden's future is somewhat at stake, and coming in the wake of some really brutal Russian offensives. Not on the ground side, not very effective from the Russian point of view, but certainly quite intense. This is also a summit where the Ukrainians are going to be looking for concrete manifestations of support. So I think that the real action of the summit is going to be in the sidelines and will not necessarily appear in the formal declarations that come out of it. Typically with summits like this, the formal declarations are agreed on by the foreign ministries weeks ahead of time. Trump-proofing, I guess there are two different philosophies to it. So simply putting, Trump-proofing aid to Ukraine involves either trying to do things legislatively or in terms of international agreements that involve the United States that will mean that the United States will find it difficult to scale back aid under a new presidency. Or Trump proofing would involve European states figuring out commitments and mechanisms for making up for the shortfall in aid should the United States downscale its aid. So unfortunately, I think that too much of the debate about Trump-proofing aid focuses on number one, on the idea that there is a way of getting the United States to sign up to international agreements or passing legislation along the lines of what is in the U.S.-Ukraine bilateral security agreement that will somehow make it difficult for the U.S. to withdraw from aid. Now, unfortunately, Congress has a large degree of leeway, and budgetary appropriations for military procurement occur annually. Also, the president ultimately decides what weapon systems are transferred. So therefore, while it might make it more awkward for another U.S. administration to roll back aid, it's fully within the power of a new Congress or a new administration to block and renege on agreements. So I think that that is more of adding a speed bump or a little bit of awkwardness to downscaling aid than it is actually preventing it. Yeah, I would certainly be in favor of it, but I still see that we could be in the situation that South Vietnam was in 1974, 1975, because upon the conclusion of the Vietnam War, the Nixon administration concluded with South Vietnam a peace agreement that guaranteed certain levels of aid, including military assistance, and Congress essentially just reneged on it the next year, which did lead to the circumstance of the South Vietnamese not being provided with artillery shells, replacement aircraft, as the North Vietnamese geared up their next offensive. Agreements from that point of view can't really Trump-proof the U.S.'s domestic aid. The second option of figuring out European mechanisms to make up for the shortfall should be possible if there's the political will. A Russian victory would be catastrophic for European security and European economies. Europe has by far the GDP, and that's including the UK, to sustain Ukraine without the United States. I mean, if we think of it, Russia is a $2.2 trillion economy. NATO's European members, minus the United States, have roughly 22 trillion in economic terms, meaning that non-United States NATO has 10 times the economic heft that Russia does. So we certainly have the collective resources to keep Ukraine in the fight alone. It is a question of, are we willing politically to step up? But I think that is probably the more future-proof version of Trump-proofing aid to Ukraine. If we were to think of a lot of classic systems, there are ways of providing enough for you to meet Ukrainian needs. If we were to think of artillery, there are limits to how many M777, which is basically the 155 millimeter artillery piece that the United States and United Kingdom have been providing. There are limits as to how many can be produced, but on the other hand, there's somewhere between 150 and 600 of the older model M198s that have been retired and are sitting out in U.S. Army arsenals and would be quite easy to provide for Ukraine. If we're thinking about tanks, I don't think tanks are a particularly urgent Ukrainian need, but the United States has 1,500 M1A1 Abrams tanks that are mothballed in reserve in the Sierra Army arsenal sitting out in the California desert. Um, I think for most big ticket items, one could essentially paint a similar tableau. Now, there obviously are exceptions. Probably the key exceptions are things such as artillery ammunition. Now, with artillery ammunition, I do think that we can probably provide Ukraine with the quantities they need, but that requires more creativity and more international purchasing of ammunition. At the moment, the United States and Europe's collective production capacity is not yet to the point where it meets Ukrainian needs. Um, but I would say that artillery ammunition is probably the exception that uh, that proves the rule. I guess another semi exception would be in the area of long range strike. The Storm Shadow missiles the United Kingdom has provided and the Scalp extended range missiles that France have provided have been absolutely critical systems that have achieved remarkable results. Now, a problem is that the United Kingdom and France only had limited stockpiles of these and are providing essentially what they can produce. The United States has 7,500 of its equivalent JASSM missile, but has so far been unwilling to provide any to Ukraine. Germany has the equivalent Taurus missile that it has also not been willing to provide to Ukraine. So it's certainly within NATO's collective ability to provide adequate numbers and even more than adequate numbers of long range strike systems equivalent to Storm Shadow Scalp ER, but that requires a political choice and political will that our American and German partners have not yet shown. So, long range attack missiles, and particularly if we're talking about the relatively sophisticated ones, such as Storm Shadow, Scalp ER, Taurus, and JASSM, have ranges in the several hundred kilometers, and they tend to be very good at hitting precise targets with large warheads. So, some very so the relatively limited number of Storm Shadows that the United Kingdom provided Ukraine have already achieved results such as destroying the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, destroying a Kilo-class submarine in a dry dock, and hitting a lot of other hardened, so therefore difficult to attack, and relatively critical targets. Now, if we could supply those in larger numbers, those could also be used to hit a wider variety of critical targets. So, if we were to think at what are the Russian army's weaknesses, key weaknesses oftentimes lie in the Russian army's very rigid command and control. Headquarters tend to be big. Frontline units tend not to adapt very well if they don't have orders from a higher headquarters. Also, the Russian army tends to have relatively poor logistics. Typically, Russian military units have half the number of trucks as equivalent size NATO units, which means that they rely more on fixed railway lines and ammunition dumps. A lot of long range strike missiles means that you can start taking out those ammo dumps, rail lines, command and control facilities. One can also potentially go after the aircraft that launched some of the bombs that, some of the missiles that attacked on July 8th. One could potentially go after certain defense factories with longer range strike systems. So, long range strike, provided at a larger scale, could be a game changer in terms of enabling the Ukrainians to hit and focus on the vulnerable rear area facilities of the Russian military, as opposed to having to bang their heads against the entrenched and more robust Russian frontline units. I think so. In terms of further aid deals, obviously, in the fullness of time, I think that there will be many more aid deals. Normally, NATO summits are a time where aid deals are announced. I don't know whether we're going to see many announcements from either the UK or France, given the recent internal governmental changes there. Um, so it's difficult to speculate on what aid deals to expect, but certainly I would expect that we're going to be seeing either at the summit or in months to come a succession of new aid deals. Obviously, the big question is the future of American aid, but that's not linked to the summit, but that is more linked to the American elections in November.